The refugee system essentially works in such a way that it vets and processes people in need of protection in the United States before they leave either their home countries or another country that they've fled to. The asylum system deals with people seeking protection at the border itself, on US soil. And as you can imagine, it's a much more complicated policy to administer because there's a chaos that attends that. There's a political pressure that attends that. All of the things that we're seeing today, the arrival of, whether it's thousands, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people at the southern border poses all kinds of administrative challenges. And again, that's on a good day. That's where, politics don't obtain, and you still have just an amazing kind of resource crunch at the southern border. But the idea in 1980 was to try to systematize this practice. And so one of the reasons why, to my mind, this broader history has to be told, starting in 1980, obviously, you can go back, even further, particularly in Central America, the story of the United States involvement in the region goes back decades, if not a century, farther. But in the 1980s, you have the collision of one other thing. So you've got, on the one hand, the creation of refugee and asylum policy. And on the other, you have the existence of the Cold War. And specifically, US involvement all across the region in propping up and supporting military regimes that were allied with the United States on the grounds and the premise that they would help fight the spread of leftism and communism. This was Cold War orthodoxy at the time. And so you have the US providing, in places like El Salvador, most specifically in El Salvador, but also to a certain degree later in the 80s in Guatemala, to a certain degree, of course, Nicaragua. You had the US providing weapons, military advisors, aid, significant amounts of money, diplomatic cover. To pick up the example of Mark Danner, for instance, when news of that massacre in El Mozote broke in late 1981, early 1982, it happened right on the eve of the US Congress having to greenlight a new package of aid to the Salvadoran military. And at the time, the two journalists who broke that story were essentially vilified by the US State Department and told that what they had uncovered was in fact not real. Eventually, the New York Times reporter was reassigned. So he was brought back from Central America, reassigned to the Metro desk, and then kind of unceremoniously pushed to the door. And so one of the things that's so significant in understanding the 1980s is you've got on the one hand this principle, this new legal principle and ethos of asylum, and on the other, the reality that the US, by virtue of its involvement in these repressive regimes across Latin America, specifically across Central America, essentially causing a wave of people fleeing for their lives. And so the two realities converge at the US southern border. And one of the things you start to see, and it's incredibly dramatic in retrospect, and I think probably in the moment it was chaotic and confusing and hard for people to fully understand the kind of human mess of it, was that when people from El Salvador and Guatemala arrived at the US southern border and presented their claims for asylum. Now, I should say, to present a claim for asylum, there's a statute. There are a very specific set of definitions for the kinds of persecution you have to be experiencing in order to qualify for protection. People fleeing El Salvador and Guatemala during those years had essentially a textbook application for asylum. It was persecution based on their identity, based on their political bent, their political beliefs. And yet, you had the US government in a bind. Because even though it was now legally obligated to provide protection in the form of asylum, the US couldn't acknowledge that its allies in the region were repressing these very people who were fleeing. And so what you start to see is the rejection rates from asylum seekers from El Salvador and Guatemala skyrocketing. So at a time when 20% of people across the world got asylum when they sought it at the US southern border, you had the rejection rates of Salvadorans and Guatemalans at 98 and 99%. And so, to my mind, baked into this promise of asylum is the kind of original sin of geopolitics from the very start. And I flag this now because, as you can imagine, we're in a whole other mess of a situation now, which we can talk about. But it's important, I think, to track the ways in which this commitment to human rights, commitment commitment to international law, commitment to domestic law, the form of asylum, have always taken a back seat to U.S. foreign policy, to geopolitical bottom lines. One of the things we'll see, and I'll talk about this, is as you move forward in time, obviously the Cold War is over, but there are other American orthodoxies that dictate how the U.S. sees the region, and that similarly complicate this promise of asylum. And so, just as in the 1980s, you had the United States government obsessed with the spread of communism, fast forward 3 decades, you have the U.S. obsessed with the spread of people. And so in the same way that the U.S. government acquiesced to abuses and atrocities committed by allies in the region in the 80s, you have a similar thing, say, in the early 2000s, or for that matter, in the late 90s, we can talk about it, all the way up to the present moment. Because now, the key priority for political reasons is to minimize drama at the U.S. southern border. And so the things that the U.S. is willing to look the other way on, it's the same usual suspects from the State Department, basically kind of deprioritizing the imperatives of asylum. So I give you that sort of just backbone to set up some of the figures in my book, and this is I've never done this before, so you'll tell me if this works, and boo me off the stage if it doesn't. I want to, I go around these days because of the political situation being what it is, talking a lot about whether the asylum system can be saved, the kind of partisan politics around immigration writ large, the kind of irony that when we talk about immigration, the buzzword immigration, what we're essentially talking about is the border, and we leave out whole swaths of the legal immigration system in the conversation. So, I'm kind of on this circuit these days. It's 2024, as you need to be reminded. And so we talk about this constantly. But I've not gotten a chance to talk about the people in this book as much as I would like. And I have to say, it's going to sound corny, but it is the honest truth. They're the ones who have showed me this history. I've learned from them, and I've built around their stories. And so the first person I want to tell you, so the idea, my gambit here, is to tell you a bit about some of these figures in the book, and to kind of cut between an analysis of what they help bring into view, and some passages from the book that allow you, I hope, to get to know them a bit, because I think this is the only way really to cut through the kind of spin and the senselessness of our political debate, if you can even call it that, on this wider issue. And I should say, I have no illusions of any silver bullet policy-wise for dealing with, what is in effect an incredibly complex global moment that we're in. We're seeing, mass migration in the hemisphere on a scale the likes of which really haven't existed since the Second World War. There is really no easy policy solution for dealing with this, and obviously the politics are utterly bruising. And so, to my mind, it's important to almost preserve space in our brains and our souls to work out the human drama of this, because we really are at risk. I feel a kind of intellectual claustrophobia these days around conversations on this issue, where there's just everything is driven by the political bottom line. And so I really want us to keep our eyes on people and what their stories bring to you. So it's a long-winded way of saying, the beating heart of this book, and probably one of the most important relationships I've ever had with a journalistic subject in my life, is a man named Juan Ramaphosa. Juan has a story that you simply could not invent, and as a journalist, I have to tell you, it's actually a liability to tell his story, because aspects of it seem so unbelievable that you would, suspect that I'm contriving all of this, but this is in fact what he's lived through. So Juan, in 1980, was kidnapped by the Salvadoran National Guard. And Juan was a cardiac surgeon by training. He comes from a small town in eastern El Salvador called Usulután, a very religious man from a very religious family. And Juan has a level of compromiso, a level of political commitment to helping the poor. And there's a rich activist tradition in the region of this. And Juan, in many ways, brings a kind of spiritual and almost religious approach to the practice of medicine. And so what he does is, along with colleagues of his from the medical school in San Salvador where he was studying, he provided medical care to poor campesinos, to poor rural peasants across the country. who in many instances were getting brutalized by organs of the Salvadoran state, on the same logic that kind of governed U.S. Cold War policy, that anyone who was poor was, critical of any of the established authorities in the country, necessarily posed a threat, and therefore were accused of communist or leftist subversion. And so these peasants were routinely brutalized, and Juan made it his mission to provide care to them. And it was during one of these outings where he was attacked by a bunch of National Guardsmen who shot him, took him into custody, and he was brutally tortured. Tortured so brutally, I should say, that the aim was to incapacitate him, to prevent him from practicing surgery again. And in fact, in the room, while he was being tortured, this was said to him explicitly. Now I'll say, just by way of sort of journalistic background, I know this not just from many, many conversations with Juan, but the actual details of his torture are so traumatic to him that I actually, over the course of the years of reporting this, I tried to minimize the number of conversations we had on the subject. And so actually he later testified, and I'll get to this, he testified in 2 court cases. So much of what we know is his sworn testimony given in court in the United States, which is a plot twist I will get to. Juan eventually survives this torture and escapes. Now, to be released from custody after being brutally tortured by the Salvadoran National Guard, you were generally entering the most dangerous phase of your existence. Oftentimes what would happen is people, captives, would be released and then picked off by the death squads. And so Juan immediately went into hiding. He was so significantly injured that he could barely move around. Eventually he escapes to Mexico. In Mexico, he undergoes a number of surgeries to save part of his arm, part of his leg. And while he's there, he falls in with a group of religious activists in a city called Cuernavaca, who at the time were helping Guatemalan refugees fleeing a simultaneous civil war in Guatemala travel through Mexico to reach the United States. And this connects up with a movement in the United States that I have to say was a kind of revelation to me. Some of you will remember this, but to me it was always kind of almost an academic question, and doing research for the book was a real kind of inspiration to see. There was a movement in the United States in the 1980s called the Sanctuary Movement. And the Sanctuary Movement consisted of a group of volunteers, tens of thousands of volunteers all across the United States, many of them signing up through their churches, in some cases through mosques and synagogues, but primarily churches. And the premise of this movement was to make good on the 1980 Refugee Act. And so a lot of them were frustrated because in the press, they would be described as engaging in civil disobedience. And if you talk to them, to a person, what they would all say is, no, we're trying to deliver on the actual letter of the law of the 1980 Refugee Act. And what that consisted of was they're essentially transporting people across the border to allow them to get into the United States. And they were learning as they went. And one of the reasons why it's incredibly fascinating for me for historical reasons is you have a group of, activists, people who some had law backgrounds, but many didn't, were actually kind of teasing out some of the vagaries in more complex strains in American immigration law at a time when that was still being written. And so there was this vast movement that relied on activists in Mexico to help transport people through Mexico to reach the United States. And Juan, while he's recovering in Mexico City, starts to go every weekend to Cuernavaca to work with a bishop who helps transport a bunch of indigenous Guatemalans to the US border so they could seek protection in the United States. Juan eventually enters the United States himself. This is around 1983. And Juan arrives, much as many other Salvadorans did at the time, with the knowledge that he had a cousin living in Los Angeles, and that was the extent of his connection to the United States. He had nothing more to go on. He lived outside in parks, initially in MacArthur Park in Los Angeles, eventually in Dolores Park in San Francisco, and became a community leader in these spaces. And one of the things that he recognized, and something that's especially poignant to me, is that he recognized the importance of talking through your trauma, because he was encountering a whole generation of people who'd suffered horrible indignities, horrible torments, but who were uncomfortable kind of suffering inwardly and not really sharing any of what they had experienced. And Juan, who, imagine, a doctor who can no longer practice medicine, both because of his physical incapacitation, the fact that when he arrives in the United States, he doesn't have a medical license, he's undocumented at first. Imagine, given what I just told you about the rates of rejection for asylum applications, you arrive in the United States, it is not a priority to apply for asylum. And in fact, in many instances in the early 80s, it was a liability to apply for asylum because that put you on the radar of the authorities, and it was almost certain that your claim would be rejected. And so Juan starts to engage in a kind of series of group therapy sessions in public parks on the West Coast. Eventually, he moves to Washington, D.C. to head a legendary community health clinic called La Clínica del Pueblo that caters specifically to the Central American community in Washington, D.C. And he works there for many, many years. And eventually, and this is how I learned about him, in the early 2000s, there was a human rights case that was tried in the U.S. Civil Court in Florida, where two of the generals who were responsible for some of the worst abuses perpetrated by the Salvadoran military had to face what was called, the legal concept was command responsibility. Basically, it was on their watch that these atrocities were committed, and therefore, legally, by this human rights precept, they were answerable for what happened on their watch. They had knowledge of things that had been committed. These two generals, and again, you'll see the rich irony of this contrast, these two generals were living in Florida for decades, having had no problem arranging their immigration paperwork. One of them had a green card because he had extended family in the United States. And the other, amazingly, and I have the files, it's a surreal thing to read, the other, a general in charge of the Salvadoran military, applied for asylum and got it. And so these guys were living essentially as retirees in Florida when, through a complex history of activism and legal research, people realized that they were there. And this human rights trial proceeds. And Juan becomes the lead plaintiff, the lead witness in the case. And so he testifies in court twice, first in 2002 in a civil damages case, and then again in 2011, because one of the incredible things that happened was as a result of the evidence marshaled in this civil trial in 2002, these two generals eventually were deported for having committed war crimes. And so you have the very strange fact these two guys in their late 70s in 2015 getting flown back to San Salvador. And you can rest assured, they were as shocked as everyone else. So this is one story, and you can see why every aspect of it is an education. This is where I want to dip into the book, so you have a little bit more than just my summary. I want you to feel like you can get closer to Juan, so if you'll indulge me. And I'm a pretty, I assume you all can gather this, I'm a fairly informal person, so if these readings are feeling tedious, just shift in your seats audibly, and I'll change my approach. I will not take it personal. MacArthur Park sat like a shimmering green island in the middle of central Los Angeles, sliced into two crescents by Wilshire Boulevard. In the northern part of the park were sports fields and a band shell. The lower portion consisted of an oblong lake surrounded by clusters of palm trees and crisscrossing footpaths. Juan knew the general geography from the stories swapped at the Usulután Embassy. The Usulután Embassy is a joke that he and his friends from Usulután developed while living in Mexico City. They called their residence the Usulután Embassy because they were all from Usulután. Go to MacArthur, he was told. You'll find Salvadorans there who can help you. Over the course of the Civil War, the number of Salvadorans living in Los Angeles grew tenfold to 300,000 people by the end of the decade. In March 1983, Ronald Reagan was issuing public warnings that El Salvador was, quote, on the front line of the battle that was really aimed at the very heart of the Western Hemisphere and eventually at us, quote. He was right that the fates of the U.S. and Central America were entwined, but was wrong about why. The Americans were helping to unleash a regional exodus. More than 1 million Salvadorans were displaced by 1984. Almost a quarter of the country's population would eventually be living in the United States. Tens of thousands of them lacked legal status because the American government refused to recognize their legitimate claims to asylum. When When Juan arrived, relatively early in this process, the Pico Union and Westlake neighborhoods of Los Angeles, which were near MacArthur Park, were already growing dense with Central American transplants. Juan walked into the southern corner of the park, where street lamps cast a dim glow. Following the instructions he'd received in Mexico, he picked out an unimposing man standing near a group chattering in Spanish, and asked where he could find the Salvadorans from Usulután. This nook of the park observed an unofficial but distinct order. The area was divided into unmarked zones that corresponded to the different regions of El Salvador. Beside one tree were Salvadorans from Chalatenango. In a small clearing, only a few yards away, were refugees from Santa Ana in the capital. An uninitiated passerby might see cliques of foreign men, but to Juan, it was as though the map of his country had been compressed, spliced, and superimposed onto a few hundred square feet of Los Angeles park space. The man waved him over to a copse within view of the lake, where 20 men from Usulután were lounging around, some asleep on the grass, others talking quietly, and still more drinking tequila from